In March of 1845, a woman named Grace made a discovery that would transform her from a victim into something far more dangerous, an instrument of vengeance. She was 32 years old, though the years she had spent enslaved had carved lines into her face that made her look older. She had been owned by the same man, a wealthy planter named Samuel Hartwick, for 8 years. Those 8 years had defined the contours of her existence in ways that could not be undone, could not be forgotten, could not be healed by time or distance or forgetting. Grace lived in a room adjacent to the main house at Hartwick Plantation, a property of nearly 2,000 acres carved from the Georgia lowlands. The room had a window that looked out toward the rice fields, and through that window, Grace could see enslaved people working from dawn until dusk, their bodies half submerged in water that carried malaria and dengue fever and the slow rot of death. The room had a bed, a table, a chair. It had a lock on the outside of the door. It was a gilded cage, comfortable enough if you could forget that you were imprisoned, beautiful enough if you could ignore that you were enslaved. Samuel Hartwick had never married. He was a man of 58 years, old enough to have accumulated considerable wealth, young enough that he still possessed the vigor to maintain a mistress. He was handsome in the way that powerful men often are. Not classically beautiful, but commanding, certain of his place in the world, convinced of his right to take whatever he desired. He had chosen Grace 8 years ago from among the enslaved women on his plantation, and he had made her his property in ways that transcended even the legal mechanisms of slavery. For 8 years, Grace had been his alone. Other men who desired her had been warned away. Other enslaved women who might have envied her position had learned to keep their distance. Grace occupied a strange space in the hierarchy of Hartwick Plantation, not free but more comfortable than the women who worked in the fields, not loved but more valued than the people who lived in the quarters, not cared for but maintained like a valuable possession that required regular maintenance to preserve its utility. And for 8 years, Grace had told herself a story about her situation. She had told herself that Samuel Hartwick cared for her in his way. She had told herself that the relative comfort of her circumstances was a form of privilege. She had told herself that the locked door at night was for her protection, not her imprisonment. She had told herself all of this because the alternative, acknowledging that she was a slave in the truest sense of the word, that she had no agency over her own body or her own future, was too terrible to contemplate. But 8 years earlier, something had happened that had forced Grace to confront a reality that her mind had tried to deny. She had become pregnant. Grace had been young when she became pregnant, only 24 years old. She had borne the pregnancy with a mixture of hope and dread. Part of her had hoped that Samuel Hartwick would acknowledge the child, would see in the baby some reflection of himself, and thus some reflection of humanity. Part of her had understood, with a clarity that she could not entirely suppress, that a child born to a slave mother was just another piece of property, another commodity to be valued and bought and sold. She had given birth to a daughter. The baby had been born in the early hours of a June morning, after a labor that had lasted nearly 3 days. Samuel Hartwick had called in a physician to attend the birth, ensuring that both mother and child survived. He had then left, and Grace had not seen him again for nearly a week. When he returned, he looked at the child, a tiny girl with Grace's dark eyes and Samuel Hartwick's light skin, and he made a decision. She has excellent coloring, he had said. She will be valuable. We should begin her training early. She will be useful to me as she grows older. Grace understood, with a devastating clarity, what he meant. Her daughter would be raised to be what she herself had become, a woman designed for a man's use, her body her only commodity, her agency surrendered before she had even the capacity to understand what agency meant. Grace had named her daughter Sarah. Sarah had lived at Hartwick Plantation for 5 years. In those 5 years, Samuel Hartwick had shown her the same kind of attention he had shown to Grace, playing with her, teaching her, training her in the ways that a man with certain tastes might train a young girl to be useful to him. And then, in March of 1845, Grace discovered that Sarah was no longer at Hartwick Plantation. Grace had not been allowed to spend much time with her daughter. Samuel Hartwick preferred to keep them separated, understanding instinctively that maternal love would create complications, would introduce emotions into what he preferred to be a straightforward transaction between himself and an object. Sarah had been brought to Grace's room only occasionally, for brief visits that Grace had learned to treasure with an intensity that bordered on physical pain. In early March, Grace had asked where Sarah was. She had asked casually, as though the answer did not matter terribly, as though the absence of a 5-year-old girl from the plantation did not represent the destruction of everything that made life bearable. Samuel Hartwick had smiled. It was a smile that Grace had come to recognize over their 8 years together. The smile of a man engaged in some transaction that pleased him, some business dealing that had worked out to his advantage. I sold her, he had said simply. She was becoming too much trouble. She would be more useful elsewhere. A man down in Alabama has a use for girls of her type. He was willing to pay a good price. Grace had felt something inside her simply cease to function. She had felt her heart stop, had felt her breath catch in her throat, had felt the world tilt and spin around her as though gravity itself had betrayed her. Where, she had whispered. Where is she? Alabama, Samuel Hartwick had said. A plantation near Mobile. The man's name is Thaddeus Crane. He's known for his specialized interests. Your daughter will be well suited to that kind of work. She has your looks, which is good. She also has my intelligence, which means she'll understand quickly what's being asked of her. She should do well. Grace had asked where exactly in Alabama, had asked for more details, had asked if there was any way to recover her daughter. Samuel Hartwick had simply left the room, leaving Grace alone with a knowledge that she could not process and could not survive intact. For 3 days, Grace had remained in her room. She had not eaten. She had not slept. She had simply sat on the bed and tried to understand a world in which a 5-year-old child could be sold like cattle, in which a mother could be separated from her daughter permanently, in which such transactions could occur without consequence or comment or moral objection. On the 4th day, she had made a decision. She had decided that she was going to find out everything she could about Samuel Hartwick. She had decided that she was going to use her proximity to him, her access to his spaces, her role in his private life to gather information. She had decided that she was going to discover why such things were allowed to happen, why such cruelty could flourish without restraint. And she had decided that she was going to make him pay. Over the following weeks, Grace began to observe Samuel Hartwick with an intensity that she had never before directed toward him. She noticed patterns. She noticed that on certain nights he would leave the house and go into the cellar. She noticed that when he returned, he would be wearing different clothes than the ones he had left in. She noticed that on those nights, his demeanor would be different, more satisfied, more powerful, more convinced of his absolute right to use other people as he saw fit. She began to explore the parts of the house that she had been forbidden to visit. She found opportunities when Samuel Hartwick was away during the day to venture into his study, to look through his papers, to read the letters and documents that documented his business dealings. It was in his study that she found the ledger. It was a large book, bound in dark leather, locked with a small brass key. Grace found the key in a drawer where Samuel Hartwick kept other valuable items, documents, coins, jewelry. She unlocked the ledger and began to read. The ledger documented everything. It listed the girls that Samuel Hartwick had owned or had access to. It listed their ages, their physical characteristics, their parentage, their market value. It listed girls who had been sold with the names of the buyers and the prices paid. It listed girls who had been used within Hartwick Plantation, with notes about their productivity and their value and their prospects. Grace found her daughter's name in the ledger. Sarah, age 5, listed under sold, March 1845, to T. Crane, Mobile, Alabama. Premium price paid due to superior coloring and parentage. But what shocked Grace, what truly destroyed her remaining capacity to function as though the world were a rational place, was that the ledger documented something far larger than Samuel Hartwick's personal crimes. The ledger listed other men. It listed transactions. It listed a network of buyers and sellers, all engaged in a commerce that transcended even the acknowledged brutality of slavery. The ledger documented what appeared to be an organized ring dedicated to the purchase and use of young girls and women. It documented men whose names appeared repeatedly: plantation owners, merchants, judges, even a clergyman. It documented a practice that appeared to be systemic, normalized, structured into the economic and social fabric of the region. Grace read about transactions that dated back decades. She read about girls who had been moved from plantation to plantation, from state to state. She read about practices that the ledger itself seemed to acknowledge were particularly brutal, particularly evil. And she understood that what she had experienced, what her daughter was now experiencing, was not exceptional or unusual. It was simply part of a larger system, a larger machinery of cruelty that had been built into the very foundations of the society in which she lived. Grace returned the ledger to its place. She replaced the key in the drawer. She gave no indication that she had discovered the truth about what Samuel Hartwick did, what the other men in the network did, what her own daughter's fate represented. But something fundamental had shifted inside her. She had been transformed from a woman trying to survive within an oppressive system into someone with clarity about what that system was and what it required of her to oppose it. She began to plan. She began to think about ways to access information, to reach people, to organize resistance. She began to understand that she had resources she had not previously considered. Her position in Samuel Hartwick's household, her access to his private spaces, her knowledge of his routines and his vulnerabilities. She was no longer just a victim. She was becoming something far more dangerous. It was during this period of planning that Grace made an unexpected discovery. While cleaning one of the auxiliary rooms in the main house, a room that was rarely used, a room that Samuel Hartwick assumed was neglected and unimportant, she found a journal. The journal was written in a hand that she recognized even though she had seen it only a few times. The hand belonged to a woman named Catherine, who was Samuel Hartwick's cousin and who occasionally visited Hartwick Plantation. Catherine's journal documented her own journey from complicity to resistance. Catherine had discovered her own family's involvement in the network. Catherine had learned what her relatives were doing. Catherine had become convinced that something had to be done. And Catherine had spent the last year secretly working to gather evidence, to document the network, to prepare for some form of reckoning. At the end of the journal, Catherine had written a note. If anyone reads this, know that I am working to expose these men. If you have information about their activities, please reach out. There is a network of people, formerly enslaved, sympathetic whites abolitionists, who are working toward resistance. You are not alone. Below the note was an address, a safe house in Mobile, Alabama, a place where evidence could be brought, a place where people were working to dismantle the system. Grace held the journal in her trembling hands. She understood that she had just been given a lifeline. She understood that she was no longer alone. She understood that there were others, women and men, who had reached the same conclusions that she had, who had decided that this system had to be opposed, who were willing to risk everything to dismantle it. She made a decision in that moment. She was going to gather evidence about Samuel Hartwick's crimes. She was going to document everything in the ledger. She was going to reach out to Catherine through the address in the journal. She was going to join the network of resistance, and she was going to make sure that the man who had enslaved her body and destroyed her daughter's future faced consequences for what he had done. But first, she had to gather the evidence. First, she had to find a way to remove the ledger from Samuel Hartwick's study without arousing suspicion. First, she had to understand the full extent of the network before she exposed any of it. First, she had to become something that she had never been before. She had to become strategist. She had to become operative. She had to become dangerous. About through it. Grace's first challenge was gaining access to copying the ledger. She could not simply remove it. Samuel Hartwick kept close track of his valuable possessions. He would notice immediately if the ledger disappeared. She had to find a way to document its contents without removing the object itself. Her opportunity came through an unexpected source. Among the household staff at Hartwick Plantation was a woman named Lydia. Lydia was a cook, a woman of perhaps 60 years who had been born enslaved at Hartwick Plantation. Lydia had watched Grace arrive 8 years ago. Lydia had watched the transformation of a young woman into a kept woman. Lydia had seen Sarah born and had watched as the child was taken away. Lydia had also watched Samuel Hartwick for decades. She understood his rhythms, his habits, his vulnerabilities. She understood when he would be away from the house for extended periods. She understood the systems by which the household operated. One evening, as Grace was bringing dishes to the kitchen, Lydia pulled her aside. "I know what you found," Lydia said quietly. There was no question in her voice. She was stating a fact. Grace froze. She did not respond immediately. "I was watching the study when you were in there," Lydia continued. "I saw you go in. I saw you come out. I saw that something had changed in your eyes. I have seen that change before. I saw it in myself many years ago when I discovered what my master was doing. What do you want? Grace asked carefully. I want to help you, Lydia said. I want to help you do whatever it is you're planning to do. I want to help you make him pay for what he's done. I want to help you expose what all of them are doing. Why? Grace asked. Because, Lydia said, I have lost too much to this system. I have watched too many people destroyed. I have reached the end of my life, and I understand now that I will not see justice in my lifetime through legal or moral means. But perhaps I can help create the conditions for justice to occur. Perhaps I can help you. Grace looked at Lydia carefully. She tried to determine whether this was a trap, whether Lydia was working for Samuel Hartwick, whether this was some kind of test. I don't know, Grace said slowly. I haven't decided what I'm going to do. I don't have a plan. Then make a plan, Lydia said. And when you do, I will help you execute it. I have access to the kitchen. I have access to food and water and medicine. I have access to things that can be introduced into the body without trace. I understand poisons. I have learned things over my many years that could be useful to someone like you. Lydia paused. But know this, she continued. If we do this, if we go down this path, there is no going back. We will become murderers. We will become fugitives. We will have to leave everything behind. Are you willing to pay that price? Grace thought about her daughter. She thought about a 5-year-old girl being transported to Alabama, being placed in the hands of a man known for certain specialized interests. She thought about the ledger, documenting decades of cruelty. She thought about the network of men who had participated in this system, who had profited from it, who had remained unpunished and unchallenged. Yes, she said, I'm willing to pay that price. Boom. Over the following weeks, Grace and Lydia developed a strategy. Grace would continue to copy the contents of the ledger, page by page, documenting every transaction, every name, every piece of evidence that could prove the existence of the network. Lydia would begin to prepare poisons, compounds that would be introduced gradually into Samuel Hartwick's food, that would create the appearance of natural illness, that would be undetectable to any physician who might be called to attend him. But more significantly, Grace reached out through the address in Catherine's journal. She established contact with the network of resistance that was operating in Alabama. She learned that Catherine herself had been murdered months earlier, apparently by men working to protect the network's secrets. But Catherine's work had not been lost. Others had taken up her mission. Others were gathering evidence. Others were working toward the day when they could bring the full weight of truth down upon the men responsible. Grace understood that she was not acting alone. She understood that she was part of something larger than herself. She understood that there were people, formerly enslaved and sympathetic whites and abolitionists, who were working toward the same goal that she was pursuing. She understood that if she could gather the evidence, if she could document what Samuel Hartwick and the others were doing, she could contribute that documentation to a larger effort to expose and dismantle the network. She made a decision. She would not kill Samuel Hartwick simply for personal revenge. She would kill him as part of a larger strategy to bring down the entire network. She would gather the evidence that he was keeping. She would copy it. She would send it to Mobile. And she would make sure that the men who had created this system, who had profited from it, who had destroyed countless lives through it, would face consequences for what they had done. The spring rains came early to Georgia that year, turning the roads to mud and making travel difficult for anyone attempting to move through the region. Samuel Hartwick, who normally traveled to Savannah once a month for business, found himself confined largely to the plantation during April. It was during this period of confinement that the poisoning began. Lydia prepared the first dose with care. She had spent 60 years learning the properties of various plants and compounds. She knew which mushrooms were deadly. She knew which plants contained toxins that could be extracted and concentrated. She knew how to combine these substances in ways that would produce specific effects while remaining undetectable to the palate or to the crude medical knowledge of the time. The poison she chose was derived primarily from foxglove, a beautiful plant with delicate purple flowers, known throughout the South as a remedy for certain heart conditions. Lydia had cultivated foxglove in a small garden behind the kitchen, hidden from general view. She had dried the leaves, had ground them into powder, had then combined this powder with other substance designed to mask the taste and to slow the onset of symptoms. Grace watched from the doorway as Lydia worked. The kitchen was warm from the heat of the cooking fires. The smell of bread and vegetables filled the air. To anyone observing, they would have seen nothing unusual. just an old woman and a younger woman going about the ordinary tasks of food preparation. But Lydia was working with lethal precision. She was measuring out a quantity of poison that would be added to Samuel Hartwick's evening meal. A portion small enough to be undetectable, small enough to not produce immediate symptoms, but large enough to begin, over the course of several days, the slow degradation of his heart function. He will begin to feel tired, Lydia said as she worked. In a few days, he will experience chest pain. He will attribute this to indigestion or overexertion. He will sleep poorly. His appetite will diminish. These symptoms will gradually intensify over the course of 2 weeks. By the time a physician is called, the damage will be too extensive to repair. How certain are you? Grace asked quietly. Very certain, Lydia said. I have studied poisons for many years. I have seen what they do. I have learned which ones produce which effects. This particular poison is reliable. It will work. That evening, Samuel Hartwick ate the meal that Lydia had prepared. He consumed the poisoned portion without noticing anything unusual about the taste or the texture. He did not suspect that anything was happening. He did not understand that his body had just begun its slow process of dying. Over the following weeks, the poison moved through Samuel Hartwick's body. The foxglove and the other compounds Lydia had combined with it began to disrupt the electrical signals that govern the heartbeat. Samuel Hartwick's heart, that organ he had used to pump blood through his body while committing acts of unspeakable cruelty, began to falter. At first, the symptoms were subtle. Samuel Hartwick complained of fatigue. He said that he found himself becoming tired after only brief periods of activity. He attributed this to the heat of the season, to the stress of managing his plantation, to the simple fact that he was aging and no longer possessed the vigorous constitution of his youth. Lydia continued to administer the poison. She added small quantities to his food every 3 or 4 days, carefully calibrating the doses to ensure that the accumulation would be gradual enough to avoid raising suspicion, but severe enough to guarantee eventual death. By the middle of May, Samuel Hartwick had begun to experience chest pain. He described it to Grace as a tightness, a squeezing sensation that came and went without warning. He took it for granted that this was indigestion, or perhaps a condition brought on by excessive eating. He did not suspect poison. The idea that someone in his household would deliberately attempt to harm him simply did not occur to him. He believed himself to be too powerful, too important, too well protected by the systems of power that surrounded him to be vulnerable to assassination. This was his fundamental mistake. It was the mistake that many powerful people make, the belief that their power makes them invulnerable, that the system that serve them will always protect them, that they are somehow exempt from the consequences that others must face. Grace watched Samuel Hartwick's decline with a mixture of satisfaction and horror. She was accomplishing what she had set out to do. She was destroying the man who had enslaved her, who had sold her daughter into a fate worse than death. But in accomplishing this, she was also becoming something that she had never been before. She was becoming a murderer. She was becoming someone capable of sustained deception. She was becoming someone who could live alongside a dying man and maintain the pretense of care and concern while systematically ending his life. By early June, Samuel Hartwick called in a physician. The physician's name was Dr. Henry Lawson, a man of perhaps 40 years who had built his practice primarily on treating wealthy planters and their families. Dr. Lawson examined Samuel Hartwick carefully. He listened to his heart. He checked his pulse. He asked detailed questions about Samuel Hartwick's symptoms and his recent activities. It appears to be a condition of the heart, Dr. Lawson said finally. I have seen this before in men of your age and status. The stress of managing a large plantation, the heat of the climate, the rich foods and spirits commonly consumed in this region, these factors can all contribute to a weakening of the heart's function. What is the treatment? Samuel Hartwick asked. Rest, Dr. Lawson said. I recommend that you reduce your activities. I recommend that you avoid strenuous exercise. I recommend that you reduce your consumption of rich foods. I will prepare a tonic that may help. But I must tell you, Mr. Hartwick, that at your age with your condition, the prognosis is not as favorable as one might hope. You should be prepared for the possibility that this condition may prove fatal. Samuel Hartwick absorbed this information with visible distress. He was not accustomed to the idea of his own mortality. He was not accustomed to the idea that his body might betray him, that the systems that had served him so well throughout his life might begin to fail. He called for Grace. When she came to him, he took her hand and said something that shocked her with its unexpected vulnerability. "I am afraid," he said. "I have spent my entire life accumulating power, accumulating wealth, accumulating the ability to control everything around me. And now I understand that I cannot control my own body. I cannot prevent it from betraying me. What is the value of all the power and wealth and control if I am going to die anyway?" Grace did not respond. She simply held his hand and maintained her expression of concerned affection. She said nothing about the poison. She said nothing about the daughter he had sold away. She said nothing about the ledger or the network or the other men who were engaged in the same criminal activities as he was. She simply held his hand and listened to him contemplate his own mortality while secretly administering to him the very substance that was bringing that mortality closer. Ew! In mid-June, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at Hartwick Plantation, addressed to Samuel Hartwick. The letter was sealed with wax and marked as confidential. When Samuel Hartwick opened it, his face went pale. The letter was from someone within the network. It was from one of the other men involved in the trafficking and abuse of young girls. The letter warned that someone within the network was under investigation. It warned that there had been inquiries from people who appeared to be working against the network's interests. It warned that there might be a traitor among them. Most significantly, the letter warned Samuel Hartwick that his own activities had drawn attention. Someone had been asking questions about specific transactions involving girls. Someone had been gathering evidence. Someone was attempting to document the network's operations. Samuel Hartwick read the letter several times, his distress increasing with each reading. He understood suddenly that Grace's sudden compliance, her willingness to remain with him despite his ownership of her daughter, might not be what it appeared to be. He understood that perhaps she had discovered the truth about what he was doing, the truth about the network, the truth about where her daughter had been sold. He called for Grace. When she came to him, his expression was different from anything she had seen before. It was not the expression of a man in love. It was not the expression of a man attracted to her body or her company. It was the expression of a man who had suddenly grasped that he had been betrayed. "You know, don't you?" he said. It was not a question. Grace said nothing. "You found the ledger," Samuel Hartwick continued. "You discovered what I had done. And instead of attempting to escape or to report me, you decided to remain here and exact some kind of revenge. You have poisoned me, haven't you? That's what the chest pain is. That's what the fatigue is. You have been slowly killing me." Grace looked at Samuel Hartwick. She could have denied it. She could have maintained the pretense of innocence and concern. But something in her had decided that truth was preferable to deception at this point. "Yes," she said simply. "I have been poisoning you. Lydia and I have been administering poison to your food for the past several weeks. You are dying, Samuel. It may take another week or two, or it may take longer, but your heart is failing. There is no cure for what has been introduced into your body." Samuel Hartwick stared at her in shock. For a moment, he seemed unable to process what she had just admitted. Then, surprisingly, he began to laugh. It was a laugh of hysteria, of complete psychological breakdown. He laughed until he was coughing, until his face was red, until tears were running down his face. "You have done it," he said when his laughter had subsided into gasps. "You have actually done it. You have destroyed me. I gave you everything, comfort, relative privilege, a place in my household, and you have responded by systematically destroying me. You sold my daughter," Grace said quietly. "You sold her to a man who uses girls for purposes that I cannot even bear to contemplate. You did that. You made that choice, and now you are experiencing the consequences of that choice." "I made that choice," Samuel Hartwick said, "because I could, because there was no one to stop me. Because the system supports what I have done, because the law would never prosecute me for the sale of an enslaved person to another man for any purpose whatsoever." He paused. "But you have found a way to stop me," he continued. "You have used the only method available to someone in your position. You have used poison. You have become a murderer to stop a murderer. I wonder if you understand what that means for you. I wonder if you understand that you will hang for this. I wonder if you understand that your revenge will cost you your own life." Grace understood. She understood perfectly. She had understood from the moment she had made the decision to begin the poisoning that this act would likely cost her everything. She had understood that if she was discovered, she would be executed. She had understood that she was trading her own life for the satisfaction of destroying the man who had enslaved her. Yes, she said, I understand, but it is worth it. Best. Samuel Hartwick died on June 28, 1845, exactly 4 months after Grace had discovered that her daughter had been sold into sexual slavery. His death was sudden and dramatic. His heart, compromised by weeks of poison, simply ceased to function. He died in his bed, gasping for breath, his body convulsing as his heart failed. A physician was called, but there was nothing that could be done. The official cause of death was listed as a failure of the heart, brought on by his advancing years and his generally poor health. There was no investigation. There was no suspicion of foul play. Samuel Hartwick was buried in the family cemetery at Hartwick Plantation, and his death was mourned by the planter community as the loss of a respected member of their class. But among the enslaved people on the plantation, the death was understood differently. They understood that Grace and Lydia had poisoned Samuel Hartwick. They understood that they had done so deliberately, methodically, and with complete success. And in their whispered conversations in the quarters, the story of Grace and Lydia's revenge became a kind of legend. A story about the possibility of resistance, about the possibility of striking back at those who had oppressed them, about the possibility of justice, however terrible, however costly that justice might be. But the story did not end with Samuel Hartwick's death, because Grace had succeeded in copying the contents of the ledger, and because she had succeeded in making contact with the network of resistance that was operating in Alabama and throughout the South. And because she had decided that her revenge against Samuel Hartwick was only part of a larger project, the exposure and dismantling of the entire network that trafficked in enslaved girls and women. 3 days before Samuel Hartwick's death, Grace had smuggled a carefully wrapped package out of Hartwick Plantation. The package contained a detailed copy of the ledger, documenting years of transactions involving dozens of men and hundreds of girls. The package was addressed to a specific contact in Mobile, Alabama, a woman named Sarah, who was part of the resistance network. When the package arrived in Mobile, it was opened by Sarah and by several other members of the network who were working toward exposure and dismantling of the criminal enterprise. The contents of the ledger were distributed to abolitionists, to sympathetic journalists, to members of Congress who were beginning to openly question slavery. By late 1845, newspapers in the North were printing stories about the network. By 1846, congressional hearings were being held to investigate the trafficking in enslaved women and girls. By 1847, some of the men named in the ledger had been indicted for crimes related to the trafficking. The network did not completely collapse. Such systems of exploitation rarely collapse entirely, but it was severely disrupted. Some of the men named in the ledger fled the region. Others attempted to destroy the evidence of their crimes. Several were prosecuted, though most were ultimately acquitted or received light sentences. But the damage had been done to the mythology of the system. The narrative that slavery was a benevolent institution designed to manage and care for a race incapable of self-governance had been shattered by the revelation of systematic trafficking in women and girls. The idea that enslaved women were passive, complicit, grateful for their condition, had been undermined by the story of Grace and Lydia, two women who had refused to accept their situation and who had decided to fight back. Grace did not remain at Hartwick Plantation after Samuel Hartwick's death. Within days of his death, suspicion began to form. People began to whisper about the timing, how convenient it was that Grace's long-term captor had died, just as there were rumors of an investigation into the network. The overseer of Hartwick Plantation began to ask questions. The new administrator of the estate became suspicious of Grace's demeanor, her apparent lack of grief, her sudden willingness to prepare the master's room for a new occupant. Lydia warned Grace that she needed to leave. On the night of July 3rd, Grace and Lydia fled Hartwick Plantation, traveling north on a route that had been established by the resistance network. They traveled at night, hiding during the day, moving through a series of safe houses that had been organized by abolitionists and by formerly enslaved people who had escaped to the north. It took them nearly 3 weeks to reach Philadelphia. When they arrived, they were taken in by a church that was part of the underground network. They were given food and shelter. They were given new identities. They were given the opportunity to begin again. But Grace never forgot why she had done what she had done. She never forgot the fact that her daughter was still enslaved somewhere in Alabama, still in the hands of a man named Thaddeus Crane, still vulnerable to the abuses that Grace herself had suffered. For the next 8 years, Grace worked with the Resistance Network to gather information about trafficking operations in Alabama. She provided testimony to abolitionists working in the North. She wrote letters and gave speeches describing what she had experienced. And she never gave up hope that somehow, someday, she would be able to locate her daughter and attempt to secure her freedom. In 1853, during the increased turmoil following the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, Grace finally received news. Her daughter, now 16 years old, hardened by years of abuse and slavery, had been brought to Philadelphia through the Underground Railroad. The message came through the Resistance Network. There was a girl looking for her mother. There was a girl who remembered being taken away at the age of 5. There was a girl who wanted to be reunited. The room was sparse and cold. It was a meeting room in the basement of a church in Philadelphia, a place that had been used countless times for reunions that were often bittersweet, often complicated, often redemptive only in the most qualified sense. Grace sat on a wooden chair and waited. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was composed, though her heart was racing so violently that she thought it might break through her ribs. The door opened. A young woman entered. She was 16 years old. She was tall and lean. She had Grace's dark eyes and Samuel Hartwick's light skin. She had a scar on her left cheek that had not been there when she was 5 years old. She had a way of moving that suggested she was always calculating the distance to the nearest exit, always prepared for danger. For a moment, neither of them moved. They simply looked at each other across the distance of 8 years and 8 years' worth of suffering.
"Sarah," Grace said quietly.
The young woman nodded slowly. "I was told my mother's name was Grace. I was told she poisoned the man who enslaved her. I was told she is in Philadelphia. I was told I might find her here." Grace stood up. She wanted to move toward her daughter, but something held her back. Something in Sarah's expression, something in the way she was holding her body, suggested that proximity might be dangerous, that touch might trigger something inside her. "I am your mother," Grace said. "I have been looking for you for 8 years. I have never stopped looking. I have never stopped hoping that I would see you again." Sarah looked at her mother for a long moment. Then, slowly, she began to cry. The tears came silently at first without expression. Then her body began to shake. Then the sobs came, deep and wrenching, the sound of a child finally allowing herself to feel the grief and trauma that she had been forced to suppress in order to survive. Grace moved toward her daughter. She wrapped her arms around the girl, and Sarah collapsed into her embrace. They stood together in that cold room, mother and daughter, holding each other as though they might be torn apart at any moment.
When the tears had subsided, they sat together. Grace asked carefully what her daughter had experienced. Sarah, in response, shared a narrative of horror and survival that was almost too painful to listen to. She described the plantation in Alabama. She described the man named Thaddeus Crane. She described the specific ways in which she had been abused, the specific ways in which she had learned to survive, the specific ways in which she had been transformed from a 5-year-old girl into a hardened young woman.
But Sarah also described the moment of her escape. She described a woman named Rebecca who worked on Crane's plantation, who had heard about the Underground Railroad, who had decided to help Sarah escape. She described nights of traveling, hiding, moving through the darkness toward a promised land that seemed almost mythical, a place where she might be free, where she might be safe, where she might be reunited with her mother.
"I didn't know if you were still alive," Sarah said. "They told me you were dead. They told me you had been sold away or executed. They told me I would never see you again. But I always wondered. I always hoped that somewhere, somehow, you were alive and looking for me." Grace held her daughter's hand. She understood that the reunion was not redemptive in any simple sense. She understood that no amount of reunion could undo what had been done to her daughter. She understood that Sarah would carry the scars of her experience for the rest of her life. But she also understood that something meaningful had been accomplished. She understood that her act of resistance, the poisoning of Samuel Hartwick, the copying of the ledger, the exposure of the network, had contributed to the circumstance that had ultimately allowed her daughter to escape.
Over the previous 8 years, the exposure of the network had created significant disruption throughout the South. Several of the men named in the ledger had been prosecuted, though the verdicts were often disappointing. Many had been acquitted. Many had received light sentences. But what could not be undone was the public nature of their exposure. What could not be undone was the revelation that such a network had existed. What could not be undone was the shattering of the mythology that slavery was benevolent and that enslaved women were content with their circumstances. The ledger itself had become legendary in abolitionist circles. The story of how it had been copied, how the evidence had been smuggled north, how it had been used to expose decades of criminality. This story had become part of the historical record of the anti-slavery movement. The story of Grace and Lydia had become proof that resistance was possible, that even those without conventional power could strike against the system, that change could be forced from within through courage and strategic action.
But the most significant consequence was not immediately visible. The most significant consequence was the beginning of the dismantling of the trafficking network. The network did not disappear entirely, but it was severely disrupted. Men who had felt safe conducting their criminal enterprise in the shadows suddenly found themselves exposed, questioned, investigated. Many relocated to other regions. Some attempted to destroy the evidence of their crimes. Several fled to other countries, seeking refuge from the increasing scrutiny that the abolition movement was directing toward them.
In the years between 1845 and 1853, the Underground Railroad had become increasingly effective at smuggling enslaved people to freedom. Part of this effectiveness was due to the disruption of the trafficking network. Part of this effectiveness was due to increased abolitionist activity in the South. Part of this effectiveness was due to the story of Grace and Lydia, which had become a kind of inspiration to people working in the resistance movement. By 1853, when Grace and Sarah were finally reunited, the anti-slavery movement in the North had become increasingly vocal and increasingly organized. The Compromise of 1850 had failed to settle the slavery question. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was about to be passed, creating new tensions over slavery's expansion. The country was moving toward the crisis that would ultimately result in the Civil War. And part of that movement, part of that escalating conflict, was rooted in the exposure of the trafficking network. Part of that movement was rooted in the revelation of what slavery really meant in its most brutal forms. Part of that movement was rooted in the story of a woman who had poisoned her enslaver and had used her death as a tool to expose systematic criminality. In the months following their reunion, Grace and Sarah began working with abolitionists to tell their story. Grace gave speeches. Sarah provided testimony about her experiences. Together, they documented what had happened at Hartwick Plantation, what had happened to Sarah in Alabama, what the trafficking network had meant in practical terms to the thousands of girls and women who had been its victims. Their testimony was recorded in abolitionist publications. Their story was circulated through the North. Northern audiences, who had previously understood slavery in more abstract terms, suddenly confronted the specific realities of what slavery meant. They understood that slavery was not just about labor. They understood that slavery was not just about the economic extraction of value from human bodies. They understood that slavery involved the systematic trafficking in women and girls for purposes of sexual exploitation. They understood that the system was designed not just to extract labor, but to destroy the humanity and dignity of enslaved people.
Grace's testimony was particularly powerful. She spoke about her 8 years as Samuel Hartwick's mistress. She spoke about the birth of her daughter. She spoke about the agony of discovering that her daughter had been sold away. She spoke about the decision to poison Samuel Hartwick. She spoke about the moral ambiguity of her own actions, the fact that she had killed a man, that she had become a murderer, that she could not entirely convince herself that what she had done was justified simply because the man she had killed was himself a murderer and a trafficker in human beings. I am not proud of what I did, Grace said in one particularly moving testimony. I am not proud that I became a murderer. I am not proud that I spent months planning the death of another human being. But I am proud that I refused to accept the fate that had been imposed upon me. I am proud that I chose to fight back. I am proud that I used the tools available to me to expose a system of criminal activity that was destroying countless lives.
She paused and then continued.
When I poisoned Samuel Hartwick, I was not just seeking personal revenge. I was seeking to expose a system. I was seeking to provide evidence that could be used to dismantle the network that had enslaved me and my daughter. I was seeking to make it impossible for people to continue to pretend that slavery was benevolent, that it was a system designed for the benefit of enslaved people. I was seeking to force the country to confront the reality of what slavery meant.
Sarah also spoke. She spoke about her experiences on Crane's plantation. She spoke about the specific abuses she had suffered. She spoke about the woman named Rebecca who had helped her escape. She spoke about her 8-year-long search for her mother. She spoke about the moment of their reunion. My mother chose to poison the man who enslaved her, Sarah said. She did this knowing that she would likely be executed if discovered. She did this not to save herself, but to expose the system that had destroyed her life and had destroyed my life. I am alive today because of my mother's choice. I am free today because of my mother's willingness to become a murderer in order to resist the system. D. By the time Grace and Sarah were giving their testimony in 1853, most of the men named in the ledger were either dead or had fled the region. Thaddeus Crane, the man who had enslaved Sarah, had died in 1850, apparently of natural causes, though there were whispers within the resistance network that he too had been the victim of poison administered by someone seeking revenge. Some of the men had been prosecuted. A judge named William Emerson, whose name appeared frequently in the ledger in connection with particularly brutal transactions, had been indicted for complicity in the trafficking network. He had been tried and acquitted, but the trial had been public and had exposed in detail the nature of the crimes he had been accused of. His reputation, even after his acquittal, had been destroyed. He had relocated to Mississippi, where he had died in 1851, reportedly of shame and scandal. A merchant named Thomas Reardon, who had arranged many of the transactions documented in the ledger, had fled to Brazil. A plantation owner named Charles Huntington had been convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison, making him one of the few members of the network to face any significant legal consequence for his actions. But what was significant was not that the men had been punished through legal channels. What was significant was that the network had been exposed. What was significant was that the mythology surrounding it had been shattered. What was significant was that it had become impossible for slavery's defenders to continue to claim that slavery was a benevolent system designed for the benefit of enslaved people. The ledger itself had been printed and distributed by abolitionists. It had been published in northern newspapers. It had been used in lectures and speeches to demonstrate the systematic nature of the trafficking. It had become a document of historical record, a testimony to what slavery had really meant in its most brutal manifestations.
In the decade following the Civil War, after slavery had been abolished, historians began to examine the Hartwick Ledger and the story behind its exposure. They interviewed Grace, who was living in Philadelphia with her daughter. They recorded the narrative of how the ledger had been discovered, copied, smuggled north, and used to expose the trafficking network.
The story of Grace and Lydia became part of the historical record of resistance to slavery. The story of how two women, one enslaved, one formerly enslaved, had used poison to resist their oppression, became a testament to the ways in which resistance could take forms that were outside of conventional channels, that transcended legal and moral categories that had been established by the system they were resisting.
Grace lived until 1887, dying at the age of 74. Sarah lived until 1918, dying at 90 years old. Both women spent the latter portions of their lives working with organizations dedicated to educating people about the history of slavery and the history of resistance to slavery.
The Hartwick Ledger was eventually deposited in a museum in Philadelphia, where it remains to this day, a physical testament to the systematic nature of the trafficking network, a testament to the courage of the women who had exposed it, a testament to the possibility of resistance even under the most constrained circumstances. The story of Grace and the poisoning of Samuel Hartwick represents one of the lesser known examples of resistance to slavery in the antebellum South. It is a story that does not fit neatly into narratives of heroic struggle or clean moral victories. It is a story that involves murder, deception, and moral ambiguity. It is a story in which the lines between justice and criminality are blurred, in which the distinctions between victim and perpetrator become complicated and difficult to maintain. But it is also a story about what was possible for those without conventional forms of power. It is a story about the ways in which the enslaved and the formerly enslaved could strike back against their oppressors. It is a story about the ways in which small acts of resistance could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances in which those acts occurred. The Hartwick Ledger, preserved in the archives of the Philadelphia Free Library, remains a document of profound importance for understanding slavery not as an abstract historical phenomenon, but as a system of systematic criminality that was perpetrated by specific men for specific purposes. The ledger documents transactions in human beings. It documents trafficking. It documents the systematic sexual exploitation of women and girls. It documents the complicity of multiple men across multiple states in a coordinated system of criminal activity.
And it stands as testimony to the courage of a woman named Grace, who chose to resist that system, who chose to become a murderer in order to expose criminality, who chose to sacrifice her own safety and potentially her own life in order to bring evidence to light that could be used to dismantle the network that was destroying countless lives.
It is important to note that the specific story of Grace and Samuel Hartwick is a work of historical fiction. The Hartwick ledger is fictional. Samuel Hartwick is a fictional character. While the story is inspired by the real historical reality of trafficking networks that did exist in the antebellum South, the specific characters and events described in this narrative are products of imagination. However, the historical realities upon which this narrative is based are very much real. Trafficking networks did exist. Systematic trafficking in enslaved women and girls was a real phenomenon. Men from multiple states did coordinate in these networks. The exploitation was systematic, organized, and perpetrated by people of wealth and status who faced minimal legal consequences for their actions. This narrative is offered not as documentary history, but as a meditation on what such systems meant, how they function, and how resistance to those systems might have occurred. It is a reminder that slavery was not simply about the extraction of labor. It was about the systematic dehumanization and exploitation of Black people for purposes that extended into the most intimate aspects of human experience.
It is a reminder that resistance to slavery took many forms, some of which do not fit neatly into conventional categories of heroic action or moral certainty. It is a reminder that those without conventional power found ways to resist that system, even when those ways involved moral ambiguity and personal cost. And it is a reminder that the legacies of these systems persist into the present day, that the mechanisms of exploitation and control that were developed under slavery continue to operate in modified forms, and that understanding the history of slavery and resistance to slavery remains essential for understanding the present.
The